Hi, friends. We've been learning about plants, and this week we're talking about what plants need to grow and where we can find them. And one of the places we can find them are gardens. But in cities where there's not a lot of grass and it's a lot of cement and tall buildings, you don't see that many gardens. But we have a story about a little boy who saw possibilities everywhere he looked and started fabulous garden that other people wanted to create as well. The name of our story is The Curious Garden, and our author and illustrator, the person who wrote the story and drew the pictures, is Peter Brown. The Curious Garden. There once was a city without gardens or trees or greenery of any kind. Most people spent their times indoors. Can you imagine? It was a very dreary place. However, there was one boy who loved being outside, even on drizzly days. While everyone else stayed inside, you can always find Liam happily splashing through his neighborhood. It was on one such morning that Liam made several surprising discoveries. He was wandering around the old railway, as he did from time to time, when he stumbled upon a dark stairwell leading up to the tracks. The railway had stopped working ages ago, and since Liam had always wanted to explore the tracks, there was only one thing for the curious boy to do. Liam ran up the stairs, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the railway. The first thing he saw was a lonely patch of color. Wild flowers and plants were the last things he had expected to find up there. But when he took a closer look, it became clear that the plants were dying. They needed a gardener. Liam may not have been a gardener, but he knew that he could help. So he returned to the railway the very next day and got to work. The flowers nearly drowned, and he had a few pruning problems, but the plants patiently waited until Liam found better ways of gardening. As the weeks rolled by, Liam began to feel like a real gardener, and the plants began to feel like a real garden. Most gardens stay in one place, but this was no ordinary garden. With miles of open railway ahead of it, the garden was growing restless. It wanted to explore. The tough little weeds and mosses were the first to move. They popped up further and further down the tracks and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. Over the next few months, Liam and the Curious Garden explored every corner of the railway. After spending his spring and summer and autumn with the garden, Liam's time on the railway was finally interrupted by winter. Heavy blankets of snow fell on the city that season, and for the first time since he'd become a gardener, Liam could not visit his plants. Rather than waste his winter worrying about the garden, Liam spent it preparing for spring. He read books about gardening and bought tools for gardening. And after 3 cold months of the snow finally began to melt, and Liam rolled his new gardening gear over to the railway. Winter had taken a toll on the garden, but thanks to Liam's planning, his handy new tools, and a little help from the sun, the plants soon awoke from their winter sleep. The garden had always wanted to explore the rest of the city, and that spring it was finally ready to make its move. Once again, the tough little weeds and mosses set out first. They popped up further and further from the railway and were followed closely by the delicate plants. The garden was especially curious about old, forgotten things. A few plants popped up where they didn't belong. Others mysteriously popped up all at once. But the most surprising things that popped up were the new gardeners. Many years later, the entire city had blossomed. But of all the new gardens, Liam's favorite was where it all began. Wow, that's a big difference in that city, huh? Let's take a look back at the city before Liam started his garden and inspired all those people to start their own gardens. Wow, that is really beautiful. And if you ever go into Manhattan, there is an old abandoned railroad called the High Line, and it has been turned into a beautiful garden and walkway. And it's beautiful to see in the spring and summer and even the fall. It has wonderful views of all the tall buildings, just like you see here. And the whole old railroad is filled with gardens and bushes and trees and places to sit in the shade. They did a beautiful job. I hope that you can imagine your own garden. And even if you don't have room, even if you don't have a backyard or a front yard where you can do a garden, maybe you can do a garden in a little pot. Any flower counts, and it looks beautiful.